This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
Well, we've had a little bit of time to digest the notion of the metaverse and Facebook shifting its name to Meta and the notion of an ocular portal to the internet, which would basically bring us into the internet in a matrix-like environment. And yeah, kind of coming out of this period of a mobile-first internet environment, it's almost hard to imagine how we could plunge even deeper into a digital world, but evidently we're heading there, and we're heading there rapidly. And with that comes enormous challenges surrounding ownership of personal data and how that data is reflected in a legal context in the confines of our own legal system here in the United States and then even globally. It's Bill Bartholomew here with you for another edition of the Bartholomew Town Podcast. Today, we welcome Alex Ebert, best known as a singer-songwriter and the front person for the band Edward Sharpe and the Magnetic Zeros, for a discussion on something he has been bringing some attention to as of late, and that is the notion of personhood in the digital space. We'll explain what that means, and we'll get into a really fascinating conversation on this today here on the pod. Remember to follow me on Twitter at Bill Bartholomew, as well as across other social media platforms, and follow, rate, and review wherever you're listening right now.
Recording in progress.
I've been wondering who sued who to initiate that recording in progress element of Zoom, because that wasn't there. You know what I mean?
Right.
That definitely is a result of something. So
I think about that all the time. Half the time someone's like, how did this ever happen? It's like, well, someone at some point sued somebody, and that's how this happened. I mean, the litigious nature of things can be really great. It always catches heat, but it's actually, all seatbelts, all that shit. It's all from litigation.
Yeah, there's an upside to it that I think a lot of people just immediately write off as like, all right, this is some kind of cash grab or whatnot. But it in theory is how we move forward with so much stuff.
I know, it's sad too, because when I think, like, if I just think philosophically about law, well, if I think either philosophically or if I sort of think childishly about law, either way, I don't want anything to do with law, because, of course, law would indicate that there is some sort of handicap I'm operating with that necessitates some sort of rules to sort of like correct what would otherwise be sort of incorrect natural behaviors that need like this external force to correct ourselves. And I don't like that, right? There's something that like I intrinsically balk at. And at the same time, we have to admit, like, that is how we've come forward as a people, is just law, like the progression of human rights, the progression of rights in general. And yet rights itself is such a like disempowered place to be like, we want our rights. It's like, well, shit, then you must be in a really disadvantaged position that you're asking someone else to give you rights. So there's all these ontological problems with law and with rights. But a couple of weeks ago, I just started thinking, I think the only path forward, given how consolidated our digitization is going to be, like Facebook changing its name to Meta, everyone's like, ha ha ha, funny, like lampooning it. And yeah, it's ridiculous, but because they're trying to obviate all their nastiness, but it is also a name change to signal their move to focus more strictly on AR. And as Zuckerberg says, quote, it's a virtual environment. We can be present with people in digital spaces. And you can kind of think about this as an embodied internet that you're inside of rather than just looking at. And I had already been thinking about some stuff. Like here's a stat that the average American, I was thinking about this for other reasons, but the average American spends an accumulated 11 hours and 54 minutes daily connected to some form of media. And I knew that stat because I was putting together something for like this totally like separate like article that I was writing. But then when Meta comes out and they're doing that, and my friend Roger McNamee, who's like one of the early whistleblowers at Facebook, was like, "Hey, read this article that I wrote that just got made the cover of Time randomly." And I read it, and I haven't totally been following the whole thing. Like, I have bigger fish to fry in my mind. But I'm reading that, and I'm like assuming that all of these action groups are already on top of this. I'm like, well, where's the ACLU? Where's this? Where's that? And he's telling me that everybody, with the exception of very few people, are all on the wrong side of history on this. And none of them, like, they're all operating from a sort of like freedom of the press and freedom of speech sort of perspective that is shielding companies like Facebook. Facebook obviously and corporations all have personhood, right? They're all people. And this is an old tradition. Initially, like, I think it was like the Persian Empire or something, but it was basically it was noticed that corporations were outliving their founders. And okay, so then we have to acknowledge the corporation as some sort of entity that is not its founder so that it can continue to persist. And then, of course, in like later on, you have this like loopholing of the 14th Amendment, where corporations are suddenly arguing that they are like actually the same people that are intended to be protected under the 14th Amendment in America. Not simply freed slaves, but also corporations. And all of a sudden, starting at the 70s, they're allowed to start donating and behaving entirely like a person. Algorithms, I learned, are being given, like right now, can demonstrably file or behave legally as persons, as the law is currently constructed, meaning code. And so this way, a corporation, for instance, could develop an algorithm, develop some code, send it off into the world. And if that algorithm or code starts to behave in deleterious ways or ways that are like terrorizing humanity, they can claim limited liability and say, well, that algorithm is a person, so you're going to have to charge that algorithm, not us. So you have all this personhooding. The cocaine, Pablo Escobar's cocaine hippos were just given personhood.
Sure.
And in positive ways, like rivers are being, there's a fight for like eco personhood and ecocide and all that. So that if you kill a river, like you're actually killing a person and you can be charged. And I think that's actually rather wonderful. But considering that we already spend 12 hours of our day, that leaves literally 4 hours left where we're not being digitized, which means that the scope of human rights is fastly narrowing to zero. And as soon as we're inside of the internet, wholly digitized, as Meta is working on doing for us or to us, and we continue to have no rights. In fact, not just have no rights, we continue to be thought of as literal property. And that's the whole trick of data. So I started to unpack this whole concept of data. What is data? It's just personal information that's been digitized. But by law, they've decided that through this process of anonymization, whereby they make our personal information, quote unquote, anonymous, they can treat it as a commodity. And then when I started unpacking all this, I started to realize, and I'll shut the fuck up, that anonymized data is a complete lie. And it has been proven to basically not exist. 99.98% of data sets are re-identifiable down to the individual. And so that's where we're at, where the premise that is supposed to convince everyone and convince commerce that our personal data is fungible and alienable and therefore property and a commodity that can be traded because we've been anonymized is a lie. We are not property. we don't behave like property. Our personal information has never been property. Our personal information has always represented precisely who we are to the collective. It's been our identity. And in fact, in the digital age, it's much more difficult to escape your personal data than it was your personal information pre-internet. You could ruin your reputation in one town, move to another town, and hope to start anew. Yeah. But today, you cannot do that. It travels with you everywhere you go. You can delete your Facebook account, but as has been sort of like documented, they retain all that data, only they strip it of your personal identity markers, meaning they anonymize it, which we now know is bullshit. Anonymization means nothing. You can always re-identify back down to the person. So in short, what that meant to me was that I could charge Facebook. Here's the big mic drop. I'm going to have to put all my earnings into some kind of trust so that like I can't be, like killed and raked over the coals by them. But Facebook and other companies like them are engaged in human trafficking. By simply trafficking in our data, they are human trafficking because our personal data is not alienable. It's not fungible. Therefore, it's not a property. It's not a commodity. It's an extension of our being, just as personal information has always been. And that data needs to be extended. Our human personhood, and that's a term that extension or inclusion of our data into our personhood is a term that I'm using, full personhood. So this whole effort would be to install into law a greater sense of personhood that would, for the digital age, which would be full personhood. And I think that it's interesting because if we don't do that and we start to be completely wholly consumed and digitized, then we'll effectively have quite literally zero rights in almost all of our waking and sleeping hours. Biometrics, all these things, we're going to be wholly digitized without any rights, viewed as total property and commodities. So I started to find this fascinating and reached out to some top tech litigators, class action litigators, human trafficking litigators. And so, yeah, I got the ball rolling and I'm kind of just rolling with it.
And what's even more disturbing about this is that as we've moved along so rapidly in the smartphone age, and as we move into, I guess, the mobile first age, and as we move into whether it's through glasses or whatever other technology that the metaverse will consist of, we're in such a rapid expansion of the integration of technology and the digitized person into our lives that the collision course that you described, that 4 hours that we're kind of disconnected right now, that is going to narrow in a rapid manner that we have yet to see. So maybe it's taken 10, 15 years to get to this point of, well, it's taken many, many years to get to this point, but we've seen this rapid in the age of smartphones and in the age of expanding social media and in the age of expanding AI and AR. It's been almost overwhelming, yet here we are in a position where it might be months, years, a decade at most before those remaining 4 hours are long gone and we're wholly integrated into this system. And that's where the crux of this is. There's not much time.
Right. It's urgent, man. And it's not simply like we could think about, oh, well, I guess my Spotify is connected to the internet right now and I'm passively listening to media, but I'm still me. I'm still working in the yard. I'm still painting the house. I'm still working with my hands. I still have this sense that I'm like this earthen human. That intensity level is also set to change. So it's not simply the amount of time that aggregates of total digital sort of exposure, but the intensity of that exposure. So that, yeah, you may be in the yard gardening, but you have these new AR glasses on that's interfacing and telling you precisely how much water to put into onto the flower pot. And basically it's interfacing with our entire lives. And once that happens and the intensity starts to magnify, all those arguments, those sort of like more humanist arguments where we can call our data sets more sort of like these ancillary sort of aspects or footprints, like these digital footprints that really aren't, that could be viewed as property, things that we can't really define as our own or define as us, because we want to remain human. I think that in some ways, one of the groups of people that are going to resist the idea of full personhood the most are actually people who look like me, like hippies, like people who want to remain human and want to think that, no, my data is not me. That's not who I am. I'm me. Here I am. But that's a fallacy that is becoming more and more rapidly demonstrably false. And we either have to be like, okay, we're going to invert the pyramid and stop social media use, or we're going to embrace full personhood and our digital selves as incorporated into our personhood. Or the third option is we're going to just march right into the matrix without any rights and become slaves to the digital bureaucracy.
Yeah, it's terrifying. And it's interesting now, you mentioned people who look like you, or really anyone who for centuries upon centuries, that if you're talking artists, visual artists, if you're talking musicians, if you're talking academics, thinkers, anyone inside the quote unquote creative class, there's been a consistent layer of skepticism and disconnection, or at least perceived disconnection from the mainstream. Yet today, particularly in music, but I think in all of the fine arts and in journalism and academia, now influencer culture, as it's known, drives you to assume that the very art that you create has to be presented in a way that feeds right into the beast. So you're almost taking some of the voices that would be most capable of sounding the alarm and sanitizing that message while ushering them right into the heart of this matrix that you describe.
Yeah, I mean, you know what's interesting? So you're probably old enough to remember the 90s.
Sure.
There was something called selling out.
Yeah.
That has disappeared. I don't know if you've noticed this. But now, as Zizek might call it, there's this, what he calls ironic distance. But it's the ability to use irony to do the thing that is the sellout as an ironic action, so that I can, really enjoy Beyonce in a Pepsi commercial with this sort of like ironic distance. And the point is that, irony is thought to be this sort of like rebellious coat of armor. But what it's really allowing us to do, and what cool has really allowed us to do, is to commoditize dissent in such a way that dissent is rendered utterly ineffectual. It's just part of the semblance of the capitalist paradigm. So now you see, that Kendrick Lamar, if Kendrick Lamar, you take him, you put him in the 90s and he does an Amex commercial,
yeah,
got toast. You could not have done that. And I find that really disturbing, because this full saturation of the commodification of dissent, of the architecture of youth, leaves us, is this term called capitalist realism, where literally nothing isn't capitalist. Even if you think, oh, it's the Che Guevara shirt, or it's this, there's no semblance of revolution that isn't capitalist. And this is one thing I struggle with even just this idea of full personhood. Let's work this down the line. Let's say full personhood works out, and we have access to ourselves, and we are our digital selves, and the corporation can no longer just simply sell us and chattel us and use us as sort of like slave wage labor. Well, what will happen is that because, like, for instance, Facebook, 63% of Facebook's value comes from personal data. So basically, most of its value comes from us typing on keyboards, creating value for it, and then it steals that, sells us off, our identities off, and makes its money. Now, if we have, if that work is an extension of our personhood, well, what's going to happen is suddenly you're going to have these third-party organizations, or not, but we're going to organize to collectively bargain for what they call right to publicity. And we will start to bargain or, negotiate our own time as commodities for our own benefit. So suddenly now we'll be pimping ourselves out.
Yeah.
There's very little room that escapes the commodification, like the total commodification of the person in the very near future. Then I have to ask myself, what's the better stage for that future moment? A stage in which humanity has no recourse to its own data, or a stage in which we do, and we're trying to resist the allure of total commodification of self. And I really don't know. I mean, in one sense, if the corporation has all claim to our digital person, maybe there's a big insurrection. The only problem is I don't fully trust humanity not to fall completely asleep at the wheel and wake up once it's too late. And so I think that, it's not like, when I'm presenting this full personhood, I'm not like, this is the answer and blah. I know what's on the other end of that is the temptation to fully commoditize ourselves till there's not 1 inch of our lives that we're not looking to somehow commoditize. If it's friendship, if it's activity on social media, whatever it is, if it's getting like buttons, all that interaction would transfer into our own person, like accrue into personal value. And that's also scary. And the whole fucking apparatus is demonic.
It really is. And then at the same time, you're made to feel as though it's essential. And in some ways, to reach an audience of, whether in terms of genuinely reaching an audience as an artist or in any other entertainment context, or just to your audience of friends or family, we're made to believe. And in many ways, technology has wrapped us into this moment. And it is genuinely terrifying to consider that this is going to expand in such a rapid manner. Never mind conversations around space exploration or anything like that, which is simultaneously building a gap between those who are most connected, wealthy, and well off, and the rest of us. It leaves us in this place where we're heading into almost 2 different worlds, and it really is the Matrix playing itself out.
It is. It's kind of amazing. It really is ontologically already the Matrix, and then it's starting now actually resembling the Matrix. Like, once we're wearing that wearable tech and whatnot. But you brought up a good point, which is about coercion. The fact that these digital environments, and this also pertains to human trafficking. Human trafficking requires either force, coercion, or fraud. And fraud is easy because the anonymized data is fraudulent. But coercion is really interesting because these socially digital environments invite us in, advertising themselves as giving us almost entirely a sense of free agency. They're like, you put up your photo, you put up your name. What do you like? How can we service you? Find your friends. And it's all your interactions. And you think that you're exercising autonomy when you're on these apps. Meanwhile, underneath the architecture, there's these algorithms operating that are designed exclusively to strip your autonomy away from you, that are designed exclusively to maximize limbic overload, to make you as angry as possible. Facebook prioritizing the angry emoji over the like button. There's an incredible amount of research on here. Like, for instance, there's a little. I'll just bring up this article. I haven't posted this article yet, but recruitment. Okay, there's 3 criteria required to form a habit. This is via Business Insider. Sufficient motivation, an action, and a trigger, says Mezek, professor. The 3-pronged approach, which is now standard among app developers, is based on the Fogg behavioral model established by Stanford professor B.J. Fogg. Essentially, and the guy who created the like button telling, quotes, I find myself getting addicted in some cases by the very things I've built. There's a lot of admittance. Facebook's own study of emotional contagion in 2014, algorithmic prioritizing of the angry emoji over the like button. But I guess the point is that there are these algorithms operating that are expressly designed to make us predictable, take away our agency, and yet we're given this semblance of free agency. And I think that alone constitutes a kind of coercion and undue influence. A colleague, Zach Stein, is making an argument along the lines of coercion and undue influence. And like for instance, the Nixon scandal. What's his name? Keith Raniere. He gets life in prison. Meanwhile, his underlings are the ones technically operating the ring. He's claiming, I have no idea what this thing is about, and they get just a couple years because of undue influence. And I think that it's also, the argument Zach is making is that you can legally charge these corporations for undue influence and demonstrate that like, for instance, there's a I can't find the study right now. I'd have to search through, but there's a number of studies that demonstrate that social media use is ramping up depression, suicidal ideation, and essentially just making people unhappy and creating addictive behavior. Now, one aspect of undue influence in coercion is making people do things they wouldn't otherwise naturally do. So now if you look at what social media is doing to us, would we choose to be addicted? Do we want to be depressed? Do we want to be suicidal? No. So social media is making us do things and behave in such ways that run counter aspirational to our what would otherwise be our natural tendencies and desires. So there's a whole legal stew, I think, waiting to be cooked up. And ironically, social media companies never been charged with any of the shit we're talking about.
Yeah, that's what's wild about it, is the legal deflection, that kind of circling back to where we started. And you wonder if there's a generation of a blend of attorneys, kids in law school, veteran attorneys, activists, writers, etc., that somehow form an unofficial alliance where maybe people don't even communicate with each other, but the pushback works its way through the court system, works its way through legal challenges, and also in academia, where this can be at least, it's unlikely to be dismantled, that it seems, barring a total overhaul of the world, but it can be pushed to the point where full personhood is something we can see in the not too distant future, and liability on the part of these social media companies. And we hear about it a lot with the Capitol riots and things like that. And, I get anti-vax protesters that show up at events and things like that around here because we have vaccine mandates and so on and so forth at venues or whatever it may be. And that at least a portion of that is coming directly from what we just discussed here. And there's got to be a way in the not too distant future to tone that down, because you have to assume that in those circles of people who are just becoming more and more angry and aggressive for no really perceivably good reason, that there's a way to harness that energy and turn it back on the very same beast that sent them out to behave that way in the first place.
We have a common enemy.
Bingo.
We have our common enemy, and I think, and that does give me hope, when I share the odd meme, like especially recently with the whole name change to Meta, there's some hilarious memes going around, and it seems pretty much across the spectrum, people approve of making fun of Facebook Meta, and I don't think there's too many people who are really like defending Facebook. At scale. So I think that our common enemy, I think the case just has to be outlined. I think people don't quite understand yet that the digitization of the human being is really imminent in a very, very embodied way, where data is no longer, for instance, the GDPR, which is, Europe's like toughest protection on privacy. I looked through the 20 biggest, fines that they have levied against corporations over the last 3 years. Not one of them was for anonymized data that could be re-identified. Not one of them. Now, if 99.98% of data sets are re-identifiable and the GDPR was not able to locate one, something's wrong. Obviously, they're either not sophisticated enough to be able to mark which data sets are re-identifiable, which they may not be, because the math is super dense. If you look through the paper of the study that actually is able to re-identify all these things, it's pretty heavy shit. Or it's so ubiquitous, re-identification and weak anonymization is so ubiquitous across all platforms that they really just don't bother, because it would be ridiculous. They'd just be levying fines everywhere. So the only fines they actually levy are for failing to put certain language in your privacy policy, or failing to provide certain GDPR compliant cookie buttons to opt in or opt out, or failing to have secure enough data that random third-party hackers can't hack into it. But none of them are for weak anonymization data sets that are being legally transacted upon. And that's super problematic. So, I think a lot of the ethical tech movement is about making your data your property as opposed to theirs, and getting consent and all these different things. But the reality is that because anonymized data is completely re-identifiable, that only 0.02% of data sets aren't re-identifiable, means that that we need to rework the entire concept. And I don't think that people can understand how important this is or urgent this is just yet. But I do think that once they do, it will be too late, because we will be completely living in the digital world without rights. And I think it's very possible that digital world will be so attentionally rich that we'll sort of lose sight. We'll just be like in a giant movie theater all day, bedazzled, and we may end up losing sight that we have no rights. And it's pretty scary.
I guess that would be my last question is, you sort of answered it right there, but whatever this type of stuff happens, whatever it is, I always think of the bullseye, the dartboard, if you will. And you're in the center and you've got the most informed, and then there's another layer out, and then there's another layer out. And then the general public is a few rings out from the bullseye, so to speak. And there's always a tipping point of the tidal wave washing away the opportunity to reach that outer wave, those outer rings of people. But there's also the opportunity to get there before that tidal wave comes. Do you think there's a way that the general public, whether it's through the cooperation of the mass media, which seems unlikely, the cooperation of institutions like public education, whatever it may be, even churches and so on and so forth, is there a way to reach most people and go, hold on a second here, pay attention to this, our future's at stake, and we need to act now as a humanity?
Probably the only real concrete way to do that is through storytelling. And whether it's a movie or whatever it is, or just a whole slew of memes or whatever it is, I think people have to sort of internalize the story. Now, a movie like The Matrix is allegorical enough. It's removed enough vis-a-vis the sci-fi aspects that it feels more like an allegory than an imminent reality. So something like a Black Mirror thing. But unfortunately, there's that amazing Black Mirror episode where the woman is on this Yelp for humans, and she's trying to get up her score, and she's headed to a wedding, and it's she needs to be over 4 in order to be able to do the toast or whatever, or get on the airplane. That's already being implemented in China. The social credit score is essentially like already in effect. And what? Who's doing anything about that? And we're like entering, I have friends that are actively working on like, we need to really be able to trust each other. So we need this social credit score. And it's like, yeah, okay, but do you not see the dystopic like reality of that? And like immediately, how do you not see the dystopia that's right behind that? So I guess all that to say that the storytelling would have to be very, very precise and exact, maybe, and probably be like legitimately like directed at these companies, not in allegorical fashion with made up app names, but just about Facebook, about Google. And the other thing is, and this is just me being willfully naive, because we have to be, if we're going to take chances, is that possibly just bringing a class action lawsuit, which is what I'm, on the precipice of doing, which means that as many people as can join or want to join the class action could in and of itself begin to tell the story itself by bringing a large enough lawsuit against Facebook, for instance. And, in this case, anyone who uses Facebook would have been victimized. And so anybody who uses Facebook could join the class action. At least that's my understanding. At the very least would prompt a news cycle, I think, about this notion that we're entering a period of human existence that will have no human rights, where 9/10 of our operations as humans, in a very embodied and real sense, will be completely unprotected by law. We will be completely commoditized and the property of the corporation. And I think once people sort of grok that in really simple language, and establish this common enemy, it's possible that alone could tell the story. Now, if it does, most likely this whole thing will just fall flat, and I'll be sued out of my underwear, and I'll have to relocate to some tiny province of, Peru.
Right.
But yeah, anyway.
Do you sense as a musician, as a writer, as somebody who has a large scale audience, that communicating not through the outstanding work you're doing in the activist and writing context, but in the songwriting context, is there any way to do that to directly impact people through your music?
Yeah, that's a great question that's asked all the time. Like, how does music change culture? Once in a while, you can write a song that literally says what it means, and still feels like a song. Doesn't just feel like some activist blurb shoved into a song. In those instances, it's about finding the right, finding the right words and the right melody and catching lightning in a bottle. Mm-hmm. On the flip side, you can always just do the typical, which is just, you use your platform to talk about it in between songs, so to speak. Yeah. But I do think that the common enemy thing, when musicians were suffering from capital losses due to Napster and then later Spotify, and musicians were kind of banding together, I remember audiences were sympathetic, but they were getting so much in return for the theft of money. Yeah. That audiences at the end of the day, they're like, yeah, but Spotify is too easy. So the musicians, didn't end up really getting the support from the population. But this is a different animal, I think. This is something that's affecting all of us ubiquitously, that we're all sort of aware of. And honestly, most people I talk to, they're addicted to Facebook. But just like addicts, they'd prefer not to be. There's a lot of people who are like, I hate Facebook. Are you on it? Yeah, I'm on it. Yeah, I hate heroin. Are you on it? Yeah, I'm on it. It's a state of addiction and dislike that that I think people are really aware of. And there are large exoduses to peer-to-peer encryption and, Signal, Telegram, whatever else. So yeah, I think there's a movement there.
Well, I mean, definitely voices like yours taking a lead on it is what's going to push this in a way that is going to gain some momentum from portions of the general public. So it's much appreciated, no doubt about it.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Maybe I can come back on once the case is underway and advertise for people to join on to the class action. I don't know what's going to arrive in my mail after you post this. I don't know how scared Facebook is of something like this. I know that they have legions of lobbyists, legions of lawyers trying to prevent something like this. But the fact that nothing like this has been brought against them yet, I just wonder how they're going to react. Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, man.
This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.